John, Tachyon, Croyd, Cranston, Jack, Braun, Captain Flint, Brain Trust, Earl Sanderson, Silver Helix, Chop Chop, Young Troll, Stopwatch, Will-O-Wisp, Turtle, and Xavier Desmond.
Hello, welcome to Card Table. Moving on to Volume 9 of Wild Cards. Got two editions of this one. The original Bantam paperback with Bloat on the cover. Once again, you got the Tim Truman stuff happening with there's Kafka the Cockroach, one of the classic characters with one of the most clever names. Walter John Williams' creation, I believe. And then Bloat looking not nearly as grotesque as he actually is described in the books, in the grotesquerie of Stephen Lee, for anyone who watched that video. And then the new version of the book, which has two new stories, one by Carrie Vaughn, once again about Lady Black, and the other by Cherie Priest, which I'll talk more about that one when we get to it. But the Lady Black gets the cover, much like with Volume 4, where it was Troll, the star of one of the newly interpolated stories, that got the cover. Once again, same kind of deal, where it's a character who didn't really feature in the original version of Volume 9 at all. So anyone who was familiar with the original version and saw this one in the bookstore would possibly have been like, I'm not sure who that's meant to be. But of course, once you read the book, all becomes clear. So this one, it's the second in what was originally advertised as a triad back in 1991, became another 4-book cycle. I mentioned before that I have some issues with the whole triad and nomenclature, mainly because a lot of the cycles end up being really including more than 3 books if you really want to get the complete arc. That includes this jumper arc, which is really 8, 9, 10, and 11. 4 books does not a triad make. Just one fan's opinion. They invented a new form of wildcard book with Volume 5, where it was not quite a full novel, but also a bit more than an anthology, because the stories, even though they were individual stories about discrete characters written by different authors, the stories were broken up into sections and kind of wound in and out and amongst each other. So this book, you get quite a bit of that. You do get the interstitial, which this time is written by Stephen Lee, and Bloat is the POV character for that. The Melinda Snodgrass Tachyon story is broken up into many, many parts. I forget offhand exactly how many, but quite a few. Almost like a secondary interstitial, if that is a thing. that's I believe that might be a coinage by me right now. As far as wildcards goes, I don't think George R.R. Martin or anyone has ever referred to a secondary interstitial, but I am right now referring to it. So in a way, you could argue that the Tachyon story is that. Meanwhile, so let's go through the table of contents, as we like to do. And Hope to Die is John Joseph Miller's final Yeoman story. Final story in the Yeoman overarching arc. Not the final story ever to feature Yeoman, but the last one to really give closure to his ongoing story that started back in Book 1. The Unintended is a newly interpolated story by Cherie Priest. I believe it's in 4 parts, which would make this the first book in which a newly interpreted story is broken into parts like that. Not the only time, but one of the few times, and certainly the first. You don't get anything happening along those lines in the interpolated stories from 1, 4, or 8, but you do in 9. What else have we got? Lovers is Melinda Snodgrass' story, the Tachyon one that's broken into many parts. Madman Across the Water, in the original version of this book, was one single story, and then in this new version, it's broken into 2 parts, which I think there's a sequence of Cherie Priest's story kind of spliced into the middle of that. So originally only a 1-part story, now a 2-part story. Unraveling by Carrie Vaughn, which is, I believe, just unbroken story by itself. While Night's Black Agents to Their Praise Do Rouse by Walter John Williams. Quote from Macbeth, if anyone wonders what that title is all about. You probably could guess it's Shakespeare, but if you don't happen to know the original source, Macbeth. There was a time I could have told you the exact scene from back when I was doing that show at college, but It's somewhere in there. Well, Night's Black Agents too. Their praise do rouse. Iambic. Riders by Louis Shiner, another Veronica story, which is not broken into parts, but it does kind of a lot and kind of continue right into Nobody Does It Alone, which is the Walton Simons Mr. Nobody story. And then while Night's Black Agents to their plays do rouse, I got so excited that I could name the source of the quote. I forgot to say what its deal was. It's about a character named Black Shadow, who, as you learn when you read the book, has appeared several times in previous books, though in some cases you didn't necessarily know that that's who it was, which is kind of a cool reveal. But that story was originally in 2 parts, and then in this version, once again, probably because of one of the Cherie Priest bits, gets broken into 3 parts. One of the 2 halves gets split yet again. So a lot of multi-part things in there, so that stories can wind through each other, and you can kind of jump back from one POV character to another. So another of the very novelistic anthologies. Also, the second book in the jumper sequence slash the rocks sequence. I think they call it the rocks triad in the list of books here in this little dealio. Which I mentioned before that I don't think triad is really right, because really, what is it? It's I'm looking at it on the camera, but it's all mirror reversed, so it's hard to read. The Rocks triad, and then they only have 3 books, but Double Solitaire is really part of that sequence, which makes it a quartet, like the Puppet Band Quartet. And I have some other thoughts on some later triads and how they're actually quartets as well, but I guess I can get into that later. Just another entitled fanboy thinking I know better than the authors. I mentioned before I want to talk to Greg about the interstitials, particularly both interstitials, the bloat stuff and the stuff with Tachyon, because they're both very very tied together. They're almost like 2 halves of the coin. A lot of times, I think the bloat story is like in 13 parts or something, quite a few parts that, and then the Tachyon one is in maybe 6 or 8 or something like that. But a lot of times it's Stephen Lee and Melinda Snodgrass kind of volleying the narrative ball back and forth. So bloat appears quite a bit in the Tachyon story, and Tachyon appears quite often in a lot of the bloat chapters. And my pal Greg has a lot of cool insights into that stuff. So I'll leave that stuff for now, other than to say that it involves the Blaze's revenge that was kind of promised at the end of the last volume, where he manages to take Tachyon prisoner and make Tachyon a prisoner on the rocks, while making the world at large believe that Tachyon is dead. And Bloat, who believes that Tachyon has always been a friend to the Jokers, is very much against that and wants to get Tachyon out of there, wants to get Tachyon free, and that creates a bunch of sort of kind of conflict between these 2 factions on the rocks, the Jumpers led by Blaze and the Jokers led by Bloat, and all the sort of jockeying for power and position, and Bloat kind of wanting to get the Jumpers off the island, but realizing that he sort of needs the power and the money that they are able to, the power, the money, and the assets that they're able to bring to the rocks. So that whole conflict is basically the core of the plot elements. But I'll wait until I can connect with Greg to talk about some of the more interesting thematic elements of that stuff. And instead, we'll look at some of the other stories. So you've got And Hope to Die is the John Joseph Miller story. Basically, the final conclusion, anyone who was reading the books up to that point was certainly aware of Yeoman's agenda. Starting from the very first book, his whole thing was, I'm going to bring down Kien. And there ends up being a few, I guess you could maybe call them false endings. Volume 5 has a sort of very Zen-like approach, which is very appropriate to the character, because Zen is a big part of Yeoman's sort of psychological profile. And so there's a very Zen-like ending in Volume 5, where he sort of decides that revenge and a vendetta are not all that Zen, and so he sort of decides to give it up. But then comes back in Volume 7 to investigate Chrysalis's death, and then in Volume 9, Miller decided to finally sort of bring the arc truly to an end, rather than leave readers going, okay, Brennan found peace, but Kien is still out there being a criminal bastard. So how does Kien finally get brought down? And this is the story that sort of gives you that bit of closure. So the sort of last hurrah of Kien. Enjoyable story. I think it all the elements that you would want from a climax to that arc are there. So not really much to complain about there. Just a solid action story. A little bit disconnected from the larger stuff involving the jumpers and the rocks, but just sort of a nice little bit of closure for people who've been following the series from the start. And then you've got The Unintended, which is the Cherie Priest story. Cherie Priest, I mentioned before that volume 21, Fort Freak, kind of looms large at the start of this jumper saga, where a lot of the characters that are introduced in Fort Freak being the Jokertown police precinct, the volume 21 is all about the cops at that precinct. One of whom, the main one, Cherie Priest's character Leo Storgman, is on the verge of retirement at the start of that book, which is set in 2010. So you just do the math and you figure, okay, if he's at retirement age in 2010, then 20 years earlier, he certainly could have already been, could have and would have already have been part of the Fort Freak precinct, a Joker. I think I went back and looked at Fort Freak recently, and they say something to the effect of Storgman having been a Nat, as a Nat policeman, and then he got infected with the wild card, became a Joker. His card turned, and he became a Joker. So he's been a cop longer than he's been a Joker, and they actually throw out the time span of 20 years. That they say that he became a Joker about 20 years ago, which would give you 1990. But he's already a Joker in the new. So in these newly interpolated stories, they have Storgman show up, right? But he shows up in volume 8, which is set in 1988, or part of it is, which is technically 22 years ago. But he's already a Joker. Which I bring up not because it's a plot flaw, because estimation is a thing, and rounding numbers to the nearest 10 is a thing, but more just as an interesting little curious bit of trivia, that they technically in Fort Freak they didn't really nail it down, like when exactly did he become a Joker. They just say it was about 20 years ago, but it's interesting to think that when we see Leo Storgman sort of interpolated and retconned into this book. He actually hasn't been a Joker for very long. For what that's worth, it doesn't really affect the plot, but just something kind of interesting to think about when you're sort of looking at sort of the chronology and sort of the established canon. So we get to see Leo Storgman more kind of in his prime in Jokertown. Like I say, originally he had first appeared in book 21, doing his sort of solving his last case just before he retires. So it's kind of a neat idea to sort of say, oh, he's been on the scene for 20 years now, but we never saw him in the old books, except now we do. So it's the story's broken into 4 parts, and it's pretty cool. I mean, I love Cherie Priest's writing. I love the Leo Storgman material in Fort Freak. I think it's just fantastic stuff. I love her writing style. That holds true for this. It is kind of more. It's not very plot driven compared to some of the other stories in this book. It almost feels more like the Wild Cards version of a police procedural, where you just sort of. It's like, here's a day in the life of the Jokertown cops, because there is a lot of major stuff that goes down, and you sort of get to see the cops' reaction to this stuff. So the John Joseph Miller story involves. Like a hostage, or not a hostage situation, but a hostile action taken against the Jokertown clinic because Yeoman happens to be at the clinic and the Shadowfists are after him. And so, of course, eventually the cops would have to come and take statements and find out what's going on. And there would be Yeoman leaving his trademark Ace of Spades, and how would the cops react to that, since for years they were trying to sort of track down the Ace of Spades killer. And then the book also has a lot of stuff about the Rapture trade, Rapture being a drug that does not exist in the real world. to my knowledge, but which exists in the Wildcards universe as of Volume 7, and is really just more of a plot device. There's not too much of importance that involves Rapture in the sense of it being like no story exactly turns on it. I mean, it's just a very addictive drug, and I guess it just lets them do a storyline where they don't have to worry about if they want to feature a Rapture addict. They don't have to do a storyline about, or they don't have to worry about whether they're being 100% realistic about how someone would deal with Rapture addiction, because made up drug. But I bring it up just because it's kind of interesting, because it ends up being another sort of thing that we see the Jokertown police kind of trying to figure out, like who's supplying Rapture to the citizenry, and does this crime at the Jokertown clinic have anything to do with Rapture? And then later there's the whole Captain Trips thing, and Captain Trips' whole deal is that he synthesizes drugs in order to take them and become other superpowered personae, and so the whole thing where he sort of at the end of Volume 8, after he lost custody of his daughter, he was going to be put in jail, and he becomes Cosmic Traveler and phases out of the courtroom in order to escape. And so he's kind of on the loose right at the same time that Rapture is big. So you see the cops trying to sort of assemble the pieces and saying, well, Mark Meadows created drugs and was a chemist. Is he involved in the Rapture trade? And so they, which is, of course, if you are reading the books, that's a total red herring. But feels very realistic in the sense of if the police detectives would only have little pieces of these puzzles. It's sort of like how they might try to put the pieces together, even though they're on the wrong track. But it doesn't exactly build up to anything. It's just there's like some crooked cops that are a little shady, and then there's the whole Jumper issue. There's the Rapture issue. There's the attack on the Jokertown clinic, and you're sort of just seeing the cops in the form of Leo Storgman usually dealing with these different things. Characters are kidnapped here, so it's sort of just filling in the sort of universe of Wildcards a little bit, if you like, in the sense that in the original incarnation of this book, you never really saw the perspective of local law enforcement, even though they had to have been involved in all this stuff, because there's a lot of huge criminal activity going down. So so you get to see just sort of how that all kind of gets filled in a little bit, even though there's not necessarily a really strong narrative of its own that ties all that stuff together. It's more just a cop's eye view of some of the other stories in the book, but always very well written. And there are a few neat little twists and surprises in there too. So solid one for sure. Mad Men Across the Water is the Victor Milan Captain Trips story that I mentioned already. Captain Trips is kind of on the run from the law, and his daughter was, in the previous book, remanded to the custody of the state. So in the beginning of this book, we see Mark Meadows come to the rocks as a sort of a fugitive from justice. And he meets a Jumper girl named Casey Strange and becomes kind of romantically involved with her. Meanwhile, Blaze thinks, since Mark Meadows was always such a good friend of Tachyon's, Blaze thinks that Mark Meadows must be there to rescue Tachyon, and you get to see Vic Milan write Blaze, and he writes a very good Blaze. When he writes from Blaze's POV, and it's a very beautifully deranged and paranoid version of Blaze. Probably my favorite incarnation of the character is the one that you see in Mad Men Across the Water. The other bit I really like about this version of the book, I remember thinking at first, they cut Mad Men Across the Water into 2 parts, when originally it was one long story by Vic Milan, and I thought, that feels a little like they didn't respect sort of the integrity of the original story. But then when I actually read it, it actually works better in 2 parts. So I was wrong to rush to judgment on that, because It's another one that's very long, that almost feels more novella length, like a couple of the Vic Milan entries, including the one in the previous book. It's really a long story, just in terms of word count. And it does work better in two parts, just pacing-wise, because otherwise it is, I think, far and away the longest story in terms of word count to be in the book. So breaking it up like that actually works really nicely, and there's a great bit where, because it all comes down to him wanting to break break his daughter Sprout out of the juvenile detention center, or home for juveniles that she's being held in, and he wants to break her out. But it takes the whole first half of the story almost just for him to sort of get all the pieces in place. And then now it ends. Part one ends with him saying, tomorrow or whatever, like, I'm finding Sprout and I'm breaking her out. And then it's like to be continued later in the book, and it's like, oh, that's nice. And then the second part of the book is pretty much just the breakout. So it actually, it actually creates a nice narrative break. Another nice side effect of it, or effect of doing it that way, is there's a great bit where, since Mark Meadows, and by extension all of his persona, like Jumpin' Jack Flash, etc., are all fugitives. So you've got a character like the Turtle, who's essentially like your classic, like, superheroic kind of character who is trying to assist law enforcement. So when he sort of finds out by tuning into police radio bands that to the bandwidth of a police radio, what do you call that? The police radio band. That's right? And finds out that Jumpin' Jack Flash is attacking this sort of juvenile center. He's kind of like, well, I guess I got to bring him in. He's committing a crime. So you get this great sequence with the Turtle versus Captain Trips, like one of those classic kind of Marvel, because you demanded it, Clash of the Titans. Like, we just had to call this story a tale we just had to call When Titans Clash, the Turtle versus Captain Trips. It has that sort of feel, that kind of almost old-timey Marvel crossover feel. But the Turtle doesn't show up until halfway through the story, so it works out really nicely to have that part one and part two, where one of the things that kind of distinguishes part two is that the Turtle is now one of the lead characters in it, whereas in part one he wasn't there at all. And it's it works out really nicely. The whole appearance of the Turtle in that story is quite great. We've got Unraveling by Carrie Vaughn, which I waxed rhapsodic last time about how much I love the Lady Black story that was added to Volume 8. This one in Volume 9 is, unfortunately, I mean, it's not bad, but unfortunately it just doesn't have as much of an impact on the events of the book, because it sort of can't, because it's a retconned thing. It's a retconned thing, and it sort of takes place in the cracks. That's the one thing about putting interpolated stories in this volume, because everything was already pretty carefully woven together. So with the Cherie Priest cop one, it kind of works because it's really just showing, like, what the Jokertown cops, how they were reacting to the events around them, and sort of trying to manage all the fallout from all these different huge moments in Wildcard's history, such as the Yeoman story that had this big huge shootout take place at the Jokertown clinic, and then this big breakout at this juvenile detention center. All these major things that the cops would have to be on the scene for, and so that one makes a little more sense. In the case of Lady Black, who's an agent of SCARE, like the government wildcard agency, she sort of it becomes the point of the story, of course, which is that she's trying to sort of make a difference, but she sort of can't fight through all the bureaucratic red tape of SCARE, because she's kind of a low-level agent, and the person in charge of SCARE at that point just doesn't share her agenda, and so she actually comes very close to sort of to finding out some very crucial information about what's happening at the Rocks with Bloat and everybody, and then ends up in a situation where there's nobody that she can tell about it because of all the red tape and who's got jurisdiction, et cetera, et cetera. And so the whole thing becomes kind of an exercise in futility for her. this whole investigation that she does, which again is part of the point. It does make for like a bit of a frustrating reading experience though, because it's like I get it, but it does mean that everything that Lady Black accomplishes in the story kind of can't have any impact on what actually happens in the later stories. That element of it is a little frustrating, which is not to say that it's not. It still does some really cool things and gives some interesting insight into the character of Bloat, sort of into his sort of the origin story of Bloat, if you like, which is a little bit enigmatic. We don't really learn much from Stephen Lee about some of the early days of Bloat before he became the sort of impresario or the governor, what he calls himself, of the Rocks. We sort of, when we first meet Bloat, he just kind of is the governor of the Rocks, and he's already there. His big body is just planted there. We don't really know how it got there. But thanks to the Carrie Vaughn story in here, we get a few little pieces filled in. From there, we go to the Black Shadow story, which is really, really great. Is that the last? Oh, no, it's not the last. I think it works out that we get the first part of the Black Shadow stuff, and then we get the later, and then we get a couple other stories, and then we come back to the Black Shadow. Not wanting to spoil the whole Black Shadow deal, because it's really cool to actually read it in real time. But it's a great example of it sheds new light on some of the earlier Walter John Williams material. Most particularly material in Volume 5, where Modular Man meets a Joker named Mr. Gravemold, and he also meets an ace called Wallwalker, and at a certain point in the story realizes that they're the same person, but that nobody else knows that, and he just can't fathom why Wallwalker would pretend to be a Joker named Mr. Gravemold. The answer to that question is in this book, in the Black Shadow story, and it's not really a retcon because it's clearly what was always intended, but it's a great example of sort of retroactive. So it's not retroactive continuity, but retroactive coolness, I guess, because it makes the previous story, when you read it again and know everything that's going on, makes it much cooler. So it's a ret cool. I don't think that term's not going to catch on, but it's really good. And it's just well written, as Walter John Williams stuff always is. But yeah, the Black Shadow stuff is super, super cool. And then Riders is the sequel to Horses, continuing the story of Veronica. Pays off a lot of the stuff that was left open at the end of the previous Veronica story in Volume 8, and then fills in some gaps in our information and what we knew about the whole Jumper / Joker Rocks / Loophole Latham scenario. Starts to give us a fuller picture of what everything that's going on and how all the pieces are connected. Then ends on what seems like an incredibly tragic note, where Veronica, if you were to stop right there, you would think, oh, Veronica just got killed, didn't she? It really seems like it ends that way. And then instead, it flows right into the Nobody Does It Alone by Walton Simons, which is continues that sort of thread from the interstitials of the first book, where every title cleverly uses the word nobody, and Jerry Strauss, a.k.a. the ace called Mr. Nobody, gets to have a really, really cool kick-ass moment. It's like, I think it's meant to be about like 6 months after the end of the previous book, and the previous book ended with Jerry pretty much not in much of a better spot than he was at the start of the book. Still kind of a sad sack, despite being rich and having a cool superpower. So this is the nobody story in this book is very satisfying, because you finally see him like kind of finally realizing just what he's capable of, and one of the truly satisfying moments, if you ever are doing a read of all these books, there are certain payoff moments that every time kind of get me, that always work for me. And I think when Mr. Nobody comes back in this one, after being such a loser in Volume 8, is one of those moments where it's like, all right, Jerry is suddenly like action hero extraordinaire, without really betraying what he's all about. You know, his character hasn't done a 180 or anything, but he's sort of crossed a certain threshold, and it's very satisfying, and ends up giving a nice, satisfying bit of closure to both his story and Veronica's, which is nice. Which is nice to see. And then it crosses back into the Black Shadow stuff, which is, like I said, really great. There's a great moment where Black Shadow gets to interact a bit with. You find out that Black Shadow actually at one point infiltrated the Egyptian Freemasons undercover in an attempt to bring them down, and then circumstances were such that he sort of lost track of them, and that's why we didn't really see him get involved in any of the stuff with the Masons from Volume 2 or Volume 3. But we find out he was kind of around the periphery. And of course, Kafka, who is right there. Right? There we go. There's Kafka. Was part of the Freemasons, and now he's on the rocks. So when the Black Shadow comes to the rocks, there's kind of a great moment where Black Shadow starts confusing him with Masonic code words and key phrases and stuff, to sort of try to confuse his loyalties, which is a nice moment, especially knowing that Walter John Williams is the writer who created Kafka. That's a great little bit. So, great story. I'd say the Black Shadow story is probably is that my favorite? Yeah, it's pretty darn good. Either that one or the Captain Trips story, because both of them are really excellent. Another cool thing, like I said, I won't get too much into the bloat interstitial or the tachyon interstitial, because I want to have Greg here for that. But I will mention one thing, which is that Thomas Tudbury, aka the Turtle, appears at the very end of this book in Melinda Snodgrass's Tachyon story, and there's a nice little subtle bit where I think it's from Tachyon's POV, and he's always referred to as like Tom, or Tom Tudbury, and they probably refer to him as the Turtle maybe now and then, but more often it's Tom, and he's mostly, you see him just as this portly guy, the kind of pudgy loser that he is in his real life. And then when you contrast that with how he's portrayed in Mad Men Across the Water, there's a great subtle bit where at no point does Vic Milan ever refer to him as Tom or Tudbury. He only ever calls him the Turtle, and there's no description of his physical appearance. He's only described in terms of the shell and what the shell looks like. And you get inside his head, he is a POV character, but it's never Tom. It's just Turtle, and there's no description of his pudgy, the reality of his physical body. He's always only described in terms of the physical attributes of the shell, because he is kind of essentially the villain of that story, the antagonist who Captain Trips has to fight. So when he's the bad guy, Vic Milan describes him in a certain way and only ever calls him the Turtle. And then at the end, when Tachyon is kind of desperately needing an ally, and she turns to the Turtle, and now he's a friend, and so the description of him is totally different. And now he's Tom, and he's just this sort of unassuming, very unintimidating, just normal, 40-something dude, overweight. At no point in Volume 9 is the Turtle really like a lead. He's either a supporting character or an antagonist. But I love the fact that he's both at two different points in the book. And I love that Milan and Snodgrass tailor their writing of the character to make it appropriate to what role Turtle is playing. I can't think of another example in Wildcards that's quite that that has quite that same energy to a character, where you literally only see the character twice in the book, and each time they're very, very different, even though they both are accurate, but they just focus on different elements of the character because the character is serving a different function. Just one of those neat little side effects of a book series like this that has so many characters and so many different authorial points of view. And just a really neat little. I thought I'd just make that a little sidebar because I always thought that was a cool little element of this book, like a subtle element that I always thought was a neat thing to pull out. I mentioned that Volume 8 is a little frustrating because there are so many open-ended things and so many kind of villains just sort of on the loose. Because Kian, I guess now that we're on to Volume 9, I can spoil elements of Volume 8 where Kian, so there's a thing that is utilized a lot in Volume 9, what they call the triple jump, where a jumper jumps from their own body into someone else, then jumps from someone else to a second someone else, I guess, then jumps back into their own body, and then it leaves the two people that were jumped in each other's bodies. So by utilizing a triple jump, you can sort of just switch two people and kind of leave them stranded with no way to get back into their original bodies without a jumper basically doing it again. And that particular tactic that the jumpers have available to them is exploited a lot in Volume 9. But the first time, or the first significant time, I guess, that we see it happen is at the end of Volume 8, where Kian deliberately has someone do it so that he can be jumped into an ace, specifically Fade Out, who has the power to become invisible. So Kian's original body is killed, and to people on the outside, it looks as if Fade Out killed Kian and took over the organization, when in fact what happened is Kian switched bodies with Fade Out and then killed him. So it's actually the same guy who's still in charge of the organization, but everyone thinks it's somebody else. But now it's Kian in a younger body with a superpower. Smart stuff. So book 9. So the villain wins at the end of that story. So book 9 ends with, Blaze is now a jumper and looking to get revenge on Tachyon. Kian is still out there with a now more formidable than ever because he's an ace. Loophole Latham is still alive at the end of Volume 8. Mr. Nobody tries to kill him and fails miserably. So you got all these villainous presences, and it makes sense to leave them all alive because it's a whole cycle of books. But you get to the end of Volume 8 and you're like, man, they couldn't take one of these guys out. So Volume 9 is pretty satisfying because Kian gets taken out, Loophole gets taken out. So that's not bad. Two of the villains, and they were kind of the two guys who were really in charge of the Shadow Fists, which means the Shadow Fists are kind of taken down, and they've been kind of a villainous presence right from the very first book. So you do get some closure, which is nice, even though you're only halfway through the jumper arc. You get some nice closure halfway through, so you don't feel like you have to wait for another 2 books before anything is solved. So that's kind of nicely done. That's why I mentioned before, when you read Volume 8, best to just, as soon as you're done, continue right into Volume 9, and it's a much more satisfying read because you get closure on a lot of that stuff. But yeah, I guess that covers the major stuff apart from the Tachyon and Bloat stuff, which we'll cover next time. That's Volume 9. All the stories I talked about, I think, are really solid. I think my favorites are Mr. Nobody. That story's awesome. Madman Across the Water, the Captain Tripp story, very satisfying. And the Black Shadow stuff by Walter John Williams. Those 3 stand out to me as really, really, really good entries in this volume. And the other stuff is good too, but those 3 are sort of my picks for like really the tops, because all 3 are just oh so satisfying, and all 3 characters get to have some real kind of badass moments. Those are the stories that sort of make me smile the most when I reflect on them. But yeah, it's a good entry. It's the Tachyon stuff is a little weird, which is why I'm saving that. I have noticed when I look online and people talk about Volume 9. The Tachyon stuff definitely, it's hard to ignore, and it sort of it can make the other stuff in the book feel a little, it can make it easy to forget how good those are, because the stuff with the Tachyon material is so brutal. I don't know exactly how all the fans feel about it, but I feel like there's a lot of, think you can find a decent amount of reviews online where they talk about how it was a little much for him, the tachyon stuff. I have no idea how Snodgrass feels about that material now. I've never heard her address it or talk about it. But I do know that just, again, it's just online people love to complain. So I have no idea like what the general fan temperature is on that. But I do know that you can find plenty of people online who have a lot to say about the tachyon stuff. So that's why I thought I'd just leave it alone for now and focus on some of the other elements of the book, particularly because there are certain elements that maybe get overshadowed by the tachyon material. And it's a little unfortunate that it does, because some of it's really, really good, particularly the Nobody material and the Black Shadow stuff and the Captain Tripp stuff. So that's my take on half of Volume 9, shall we say. And then with any luck, I have my friend Greg on, and we can talk about the tachyon boat stuff, because he's just got some really very thoughtful and insightful takes on that stuff. So we'll catch you then. So in the meantime, I do recommend Volume 9, with the proviso that you might find the tachyon material pretty brutal. Triggering, I guess it would be the word to use now. It might be the kind of stuff where you might want to go online and get a little warning for what you're going to see, but still, I think a lot of really strong material in Volume 9. I think it's probably a step up on Volume 8, because it really takes the jumper stuff and the stuff on the rocks to kind of a new level of intensity, and you do get some satisfying closure from some of the stuff that was left open in Volume 8. And then it also leaves you with a little cliffhanger going into Volume 10, but we'll look at that next time.
Doesn't have any class. She says, "Hon, what is it?" "I'm trying to visit with my pal Melinda Snodgrass. Shoot the breeze with Walter John Williams. Hang out with Howard Waldrop. I've been smarting for George R.R. Martin. His characters have so much pop. I like to go out dancing. My baby loves a bunch of authors. My heart's broken several places. Baby's just sitting there reading about aces."